So as I said, we were looking last week at Abraham, his wife Sarah, and their son Isaac in Genesis 22. And as we go on from there, Isaac got married, and he had two children. He had Esau and Jacob. And later Jacob would get married, and he'd have 12 sons. And so that nation is starting to take form, right? I think especially with Jacob's 12 sons, his descendants are really beginning to multiply now and becoming a great nation. And one of those sons is named Joseph, and he's kind of the focus of our story, but it's really him and his brothers, and especially Joseph's life. But Joseph was the second youngest of the 12 brothers, okay? So there was only one brother that was younger than Joseph. And we meet Joseph in Genesis 37, and he is his father's favorite. His dad gives him a coat of many colors, a snazzy jacket to wear, and it's different than everyone else's because most of the people, their coats were one color because it was one piece of fabric. And so it was unusual to have one of many colors, and that's what Joseph got. And when the other brothers saw that he got a coat of many colors and they did not, they realized, oh, he's Dad's favorite, which didn't go over well with the other brothers. They didn't like that there was a favorite. Good lesson for us not to pick favorites of our children because they got jealous of Joseph and that place he held in his father's heart. And then it even got a little worse with the jealousy because later Joseph had a dream. And he told his brothers about that dream, which was part of the mistake. But in his dream, he saw that his brothers would bow down before him, that his parents would also bow down before him. And of course, this is not the way things went back in those times. The younger people would bow to the older people. They would bow and show respect and honor to those who were their elders. And so for the elders to be bowing to the second youngest son was not the normal way to do things. And so when he shared that with the brothers, they said, all right, this has gone far enough. This kid is obnoxious. We need to do something with Joseph. We need to get rid of him. And actually, some of his brothers said, let's just kill him and let's be done with it. The other brothers said, well, maybe we shouldn't do that. Let's just pretend that he is dead. And so what they ended up doing was they took his coat of many colors, they ripped it up, they poured goat's blood on it, and they took it back to their father saying some vicious animal must have gotten a hold of Joseph. And so they acted like he was dead, and instead they sold him into slavery. Some slave traders were walking by, and they sold their brother Joseph off to them. And I've often wondered, what would have that been like to have your brothers sell you off? But I've heard of young kids doing that, though, like when a new baby is born, that they want to get rid of the baby, and they would freely sell them. I don't know if we have any younger people that think you would have been sold by your siblings. I bet my brother would have sold me in a heartbeat if he had the chance. Any older siblings here that want to sell their younger siblings? No one's going to, we got one that would admit to it. But that's kind of funny, but this is not. This is real life. That his brothers would sell him off to slave traders in order to get rid of him in hopes that they would never see him again. That's how jealous they were of him, and that's how much they didn't like Joseph and the things that were going on with him in their family. And so he gets sold off into slavery, and it's there that he gets taken down to Egypt, and he gets sold to a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was the commander of the guard of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the king of Egypt, the guy that's in charge of Egypt. And so this guy's in charge of their guard, and he hires Joseph to be a servant of his. And while there, God is with Joseph in slavery. And Joseph begins to work hard, and he is blessed in the work that he does. And so eventually he works his way up to become the top servant in Potiphar's house. Potiphar puts Joseph in charge of all of his household. Everything that happens, Joseph is the one that takes care of those things for Potiphar. And that is until Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of making advances towards her. And so Potiphar doesn't like those accusations and sends him to prison and puts him in prison. And so Joseph kind of had worked his way up. Now he's back at the bottom again. And he has to start over as a lowly person in the prison. Where at the prison, the prisoners did a lot of the work and those kind of things. So God was with Joseph again. He continued to work hard, and he began to work himself up through the ranks in that prison as well and became well respected in the prison. Eventually, he gets released from prison by the Pharaoh, because the Pharaoh has a dream that nobody can interpret except for Joseph. They hear that he is good at interpreting dreams, and so they bring him to Pharaoh. He interprets the dream and gets released from prison. And that dream that Pharaoh has is that they're going to have 7 years of plenty of crops, 7 good years in the farms, and then 7 years of drought. And so the plan is, well, in those 7 good years, let's store everything up that we can so that it can provide for us during the drought. But we're going to need someone in charge of that. And Pharaoh says, well, why don't we put Joseph in charge? He seems to know what's going on, and so Joseph becomes the man in charge of Egypt's food supply. And he's the one in charge of gathering those things in those good years, and then when the drought hits, he's the one in charge of distributing the food to those who are in need. And it is true that those 7 good years come, the 7 bad years are in front of them, and as that drought hits Egypt, it also hits Israel, back where Joseph's family is, his father and his brothers. And it's so bad there that they say, we hear there's food in Egypt. Let's go down there and see if we can get food. And so guess what? 10 of his brothers come down to Joseph. It's been 21 years since they've seen him, 21 years since they sold him into slavery, and they don't recognize him when they see him. But they come and they bow before him. So they fulfill that dream that Joseph had. They bow before him and they ask for help with their food. And so through lots of different things, as Joseph kind of tests their motives, tries to find out if his dad's still alive, eventually he says, just bring Dad and everybody to come on down and I'll take care of you all. And so they all do. Joseph invites his whole family down, his father Jacob and his other brothers. They all come and live with him there in Egypt. And they lived there for 17 years. And then that's where we have the passage that we looked at this morning. For 17 years, they lived there under the care of Joseph. But now, 17 years later, his dad dies. Jacob dies. And it's at that moment that his brothers begin to worry. What if Joseph now takes revenge on us? What if Joseph now is going to treat us poorly? Because he's been treating us pretty well, but maybe he's just doing that for Dad's sake. And now that Dad is gone, maybe he's going to take revenge on us. And so they say, Dad said you're supposed to be nice to us. That was his dying wish, that you'd be nice to us. And so we're not sure that that's true. I think they made it up, but maybe Jacob did say that. But they said, Dad says you're supposed to be nice to us. And then I love Joseph's response. Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? What you did, you intended for evil, but God intended it for good. So don't be afraid. I'm going to take care of you and your children. I'm going to take care of our family. And it's Joseph's perspective through life that I think is something for us to grab a hold of today. Something for us to consider, how can we look at life the same way that Joseph did? How can we move through life and its ups and downs the same way that Joseph did? And that's what I want us to try and grab onto today. Because life does go up and down, doesn't it? Have you noticed in your life as you look back, is there good times and bad times? And it goes up and down. Sometimes it goes slowly, sometimes it's quickly. So it goes from bad to good to bad. Sometimes it goes from bad to worse at times, and sometimes it goes from good to great at other times. But my life has always been kind of moving along, up and down. Is that what your life is like? It doesn't just go constant and just nice and easy the whole time. It's moving up and down. And it's amazing, as Joseph went through all those ups and downs, from being the favorite son to being a slave, to going into prison, to growing in the ranks, to them being the second in command in Egypt, the one in charge of all the food. Through all those ups and downs, I just feel Joseph has been consistent and constant in the midst of it. He just continues to work hard and to move forward and allow God to be with him and to bless him in those things. And so I want us to think about, how can we hold on to that same kind of attitude that Joseph had? And I think we see his attitude in his response to his brothers, especially when he says, am I in the place of God? He recognizes the place that God needs to have in his life. Because so many times we put ourselves in the center of life, and everything revolves around us, especially our life is all about me. But Joseph says, maybe God's the one that's supposed to be in that place. I'm not in God's place. God is in his place. And from God's place, which would be kind of the throne room of heaven, from God's perspective, our life looks different than our perspective, doesn't it? There's two different kind of perspectives on our life. And a pastor once taught me that as we read the scriptures and as we look at our lives, there's two stories going on all the time. There is the lower story and there's the upper story. And that's what I want us to kind of hold on to this morning, is there's the lower story and the upper story. The lower story is the life that we live. The lower story is what's going on in reality around us. In the lower story, we're still striving to get that relationship with God and connect with God. And so in the lower story, we get frustrated. In the lower story, we get angry, we struggle, we have difficulties. And in the lower story, we focus on the details of our life. We recognize the prisons and the brothers and the pieces of our story that are kind of holding us back and not allowing us to move forward. The lower story is just kind of the things that are going on around us. But at the exact same time, there's an upper story that's happening. There's a story in our life that God sees from his perspective in God's place. And when God looks at our story, he's not always paying attention necessarily to all those details, but God looks to see the promises and the fulfillment the hope that will come in each and every one of our lives as we follow him. He sees that bigger picture. When we're in the lower story, we get caught in all the details. Does that make sense? That those two stories can be going on at the same time? And what I want to encourage us to do is to think about how we can step back from the details that hold us down and recognize the upper story that is happening in our lives. Can we look from God's perspective at what's going on in our lives and see really the good that God is doing? Even when we see difficulty, when we see evil or struggle, can we see the good that God intends to come from that? Now, when I say that, I'm not saying God causes bad things to happen so that he can make good come out of it. I'm not saying that. But I say whatever happens in our lives, I think God is moving it towards good. God is working for the good of his people as we follow him. And so I want to encourage us this morning to think about how we can see our lives from God's perspective. We need to see our lives from God's place. So think about God's place in the throne room of heaven, looking on our life. Can we look at our lives in that way and have that perspective, seeing the love and the grace and the hope that God has promised and will come in our lives if we follow him, compared to seeing all the details, all the little things that hold us back, the prisons that we get stuck in, that keep us from that hope and that grace and love that God has for us. We need to work in our lives to let go of the details and see that bigger picture. See from God's place and from God's perspective all the good that he has for each and every one of us. I think Joseph does that through his life. He doesn't allow the details to hold him back. He doesn't allow that his brothers sell him into slavery, that he's in prison, to say, well, I should just give up. Or I'm going to turn to revenge and bitterness and anger. I'm going to turn to those things. He doesn't do that. He says, God's going to do good, and I'm going to just keep following him even in this difficult time of my life. And so I want us to think about this morning as we look back on our lives, especially thinking of the difficult times, the hard times. Can we see the good that God brings in our lives? Can we see the good that God will bring out of the difficulties that we face? The good that he wants to offer to us, the blessing that can come. Not ignoring that past or ignoring the hurt and pain that was there, but how can we move towards the good that God has? As I was reflecting back this week on my life, I was thinking of one of those down years. A very difficult year in my life was 2011. Not too long ago, but a little while ago. That was a difficult year because Helen's mom was battling cancer for the second time and was really having a hard time. Helen was going down to Tennessee. I think every month she went down during her mom's treatments just to help out at home and to encourage her and to try and lift her spirits. That year also in March, my mom's mom died. My grandma was the first one, grandparent I'd lost since 1987. That was when my grandpa died. And then I had 3 grandparents for the rest of my life until 2011. And being raised by a single mom, my grandparents stepped in a lot. I was very close with my grandparents because they would come, they'd watch us, or we'd go to their houses, and they'd take care of us. And so I was very close with them, and I was so glad to have them most of my life. But in 2011, my mom's mom died, 97 years old. That's a pretty good life, I think, living to 97. But then later that year on Thanksgiving Day, my dad's mom died. And our family normally, we have a great Thanksgiving meal at Grandma's house, and she prepares the meal, and we're around her big table in the dining room. But that year we didn't do Thanksgiving meal because Grandma was in a hospital bed in the dining room on hospice care. And she died that evening of Alzheimer's. And was a tough thing for us to see with Grandma going through. My grandma, near the end of her life, couldn't get a sentence together. She couldn't get a full sentence out. And that was tough because she was an English teacher. That's what she did in her life, and she was a historian. She was our city historian, our church historian, and our family historian. And she would tell history stories all the time. When we go over to Grandma's, we'd sit on the front porch and swing with her, and she'd tell us stories, especially of her dad, who was an engineer on the railroad, and would tell us about his adventures on the railroad. She'd tell us stories of my dad growing up and stories of us when we were younger. And so her life was telling a story, and near the end of her life, she couldn't get a sentence out. And so it was so difficult to see her go through that as I look back now, the doctors were amazed that she moved so quickly through Alzheimer's. She went through the last couple of phases of that disease in weeks compared to months or years. I've seen people go on for years not knowing who their family is. And it just broke my heart to think of my grandma doing that. But she moved so quickly that she died within weeks of getting to the end phases of Alzheimer's. And as I look back now, it was still painful and difficult, but I also see God's mercy, that she didn't just hang on and didn't just linger and didn't just go on in body and not in mind. And so I look back at that difficulty, and I see God's bigger story is a story of mercy as he freed her from that disease. And I know I'll see her again, and she'll have lots to say that she had been storing up from that time that she wasn't able to speak very well. And I just know that hope is there because I can step back and see the upper story. I can see God's story of love and grace and hope that was working in my grandmother's life and working in my life. And so I want to encourage us as we look back, as we think about the difficulties, the pains, and the hurts that we have, can we also see the bigger story? Can we see that upper story of God's grace and mercy working in us and working through us? I think Joseph saw that. I think that's what helped him to continue on with his story. He had so many opportunities where he could have just given up, and he could have just said, this is terrible, and woe is me, and I'm just going to not go any further. But he didn't. He kept moving forward and kept his eyes on that upper story that God had placed in his life. And I think a big part of that, too, specifically what he's talking about here, is forgiveness. That forgiveness is needed for us to connect with the upper story. I think it's almost impossible to really see the upper story that God has for us without forgiveness. Because if we're withholding forgiveness, that means we're holding on to the bitterness and the hurt and the anger and revenge that we have in our lives. Because we all have opportunities for that. Because we've all been hurt. We've all been knocked down. We've all had people that have done things that were evil in our lives. And if we hold on to those things, if we let our minds linger and our hearts linger there, I think it's impossible to see the upper story. Because the upper story is a story of forgiveness, a story of grace and mercy. And so if we keep in that mindset of anger and revenge for things that have happened in our past, we're never going to connect to that upper story. But we need to. Joseph shows us that we need to offer forgiveness. And forgiveness, it works on both levels. Forgiveness works on both levels, in the upper and the lower story. It works in the lower story because it frees us from that anger and that pain. It frees us from the prisons that we get put into by the evil that happens to us. It frees us from those things. If we don't offer forgiveness, we're going to be stuck there in the lower story. And so we have to learn to be able to let go of those things, to offer forgiveness to those who have hurt us. Which, unfortunately, as Joseph shows us, sometimes those hurts come from family, don't they? They come from our brothers, our sisters, from our parents, our loved ones. They hurt us. And so we have to offer forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from our Christian family, from our church family, unfortunately, because we are still imperfect, even though we strive to be people of God's love. And so maybe it's someone like that we offer forgiveness to. It comes from strangers, too, that hurt us. And maybe we don't have the opportunity to say to somebody, you're forgiven, and yet we still need to forgive. We need to offer that up to God, the forgiveness we offer to that person that brought some evil into our lives, that moved us down a difficult path. We need to offer that forgiveness to be released from being stuck in the lower story, to then connect with the upper story. But I also think that when we offer forgiveness to someone else, we're showing them the upper story. We're inviting them into it, because I bet if we don't offer them forgiveness, that kind of helps keep them in the lower story. Joseph's brothers are still connected to the lower story. And the amazing thing is, it was 21 years since they had seen him, right? So they sold him into slavery. 21 years later, they are reunited with him. This is 17 years later than that when their dad dies. It's been almost 40 years. And they're still worried about being forgiven for something they had done 40 years ago. For 40 years, they still were holding on to that guilt, that shame, and that pain was still in their lives because they hadn't given it up with the forgiveness that they were offered. Actually, Joseph had offered forgiveness too when he was reunited with them. He already forgave them, but they still were holding on to it 17 years later. And he offers that forgiveness again, trying to invite them out of that lower story and into the upper story. We have to be willing to forgive other people. And again, I think that's easy to say. It's hard to do. And so it's up to us to take that time to speak with God, to step back into God's place and from God's perspective to see our life and be willing to offer that forgiveness to those who have hurt us, to offer forgiveness to the things that have been evil in our lives, but that God might then bring some good from the midst of that. We have to embrace forgiveness and give it to those who are around us. We also probably need to ask for forgiveness for the times we've hurt others as well. And so maybe we need to do that as well, as ask for that forgiveness because of the hurts we've caused. But we need to embrace forgiveness, to move into that upper story and to really have God's perspective. And I think, again, Joseph shows us that. And in the midst of all that Joseph goes through, the ups and the downs, as he sees things from God's place, as he offers that forgiveness, I think in all of it, really God's place has been with Joseph. If you read through the scripture starting in Genesis 37 and read through, every time something bad happens to Joseph, it says God was with him as he continued to work and to move to the next thing. And he was sold into slavery, but God was with him. He was put in prison, but God was with him. He was put in charge of Pharaoh's food supply, but God was with him. And so God's place was right next to him through the whole thing, and he recognized that the upper story was happening as God was with him, and as he looked at things from God's place, God's perspective in his life. And so this morning, I just want to encourage you as you look back on your life, and as you look forward on your life, know that things are going to go up and down. There's going to be all kinds of things that happen in the lower story of your life. But know in the upper story, I believe that God has good things for you. God has blessings for you, and God wants to fulfill those things as we connect with that upper story, as we live into it by offering forgiveness and grace and mercy to those who are around us, and as we're guided in love to live as disciples of Jesus Christ. May you continue to connect with the upper story and live out all that God has for you. Let us pray. Gracious God, I thank you for you being in your place, that we would in our lives put you in the place as the one that's in the center of our lives, the one that is with us through the ups and downs of life, the one that calls us to live in hope and love and grace. Lord, help us to connect more with the upper story and not get stuck in the lower story. So often, Lord, the details and the struggles of life hold us down. Lord, set us free to live fully in the upper story that you have for us. Continue to guide us and direct us. Bring healing in our bodies through the offering of forgiveness. Continue your work, Lord, of leading us to the good you have for us. We pray this all in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen.